Hello everyone! To understand how inverse, converse, and contrapositive are taken from the conditional statements, let us review first on what conditional statement is. So a statement written in the if-then form is a conditional statement. And the conditional statement has two parts, the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the part of the statement following if is called the hypothesis, and the part of the statement following then is called the conclusion. So to take the inverse, converse, and contrapositive of the conditional statements, let us remember these concepts. To have the inverse form, we need to negate or take the opposite of the hypothesis and conclusion. And to have the converse form, we are going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion. Meaning, the hypothesis becomes the conclusion and the conclusion becomes the hypothesis. And then, to have the contrapositive form, we are going to switch and negate or take the opposite of the hypothesis and conclusion. Examples. Okay, let us have this first example. Suppose this is our original if-then statement or conditional statement. If I am not able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning, then I feel sick. So the hypothesis is I am not able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning. And the conclusion is I feel sick. So to give the inverse form, we are going to give the opposite of the hypothesis. So the hypothesis starts with I am not able. So the opposite of not able is able. So that becomes if I am able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning. And then for the conclusion, which is I feel sick, this becomes I don't feel sick or I do not feel sick. So this one here, then I don't feel sick. So the inverse is if I am able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning, then I don't feel sick. And then for the converse form, we are going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So this hypothesis here, which is I am not able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning, this will be our conclusion in the converse form. And this conclusion here, I feel sick, this becomes the hypothesis in the converse form. So we have this one. If I feel sick, then I am not able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning. And then for the contrapositive, we are going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion of the original statement as well as negating or taking the opposite of the hypothesis and conclusion. So we have this one. If I don't feel sick, then I am able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning. So actually, the contrapositive is the inverse form of the converse of the original statement. Observe this one. The converse is I feel sick in the hypothesis. That becomes I don't feel sick in the contrapositive. And then for the converse, which is in the conclusion, we have I am not able to rise up before 6 o'clock in the morning. This not able becomes able in the contrapositive form. Okay? So the contrapositive form is just the inverse of the converse in the original statement. Okay, another example. Okay, suppose this is our conditional statement. If you freeze water, then it will turn to ice. And that's true, di ba? To have the inverse form, this hypothesis, which is you freeze water, becomes you do not freeze water. And then for the conclusion in the original statement, which is it will turn to ice, in the inverse form, that becomes it will not turn to ice. Just take the opposite of the hypothesis and conclusion. And then for the converse form, we have this one. If the water turns to ice, then you freeze it. So just switch the hypothesis and conclusion. The conclusion, which is it will turn to ice, and this it refers to the water, di ba? So we may have the converse form, which is this one, if the water turns to ice. So this will be our hypothesis. And then the conclusion is you freeze it. So the it refers to the water. Okay? And then for our contrapositive, just give the opposite or just negate the converse form of the original statement. So we have this one. If the water will not turn to ice, observe this one. In the converse form, the water turns to ice. In the contrapositive form, that becomes the water will not turn to ice. Okay? And then for the conclusion, you freeze it. In the contrapositive form, that becomes you do not freeze it in the conclusion. So the whole contrapositive is if the water will not turn to ice, then you do not freeze it, or if you do not freeze the water. Okay, another example. Suppose this is our conditional statement or the if then form. If you don't finish your homework, you are not going to play games. 'Di ba? Kadalasan itong sinasabi ng mga magulang niyo sa inyo, 'di ba? If you don't finish your homework, you are not going to play games. So to have the inverse form, we have this one. If you finish your homework, so this one, don't finish, becomes finish. So we just delete the don't to have the opposite form. Okay? And then for the conclusion, you are not going to play games in the original statement. That becomes, you are going to play games in the inverse form. So just give the opposite of the hypothesis and the conclusion in the original if-then statement or conditional statement. And then for the converse, we are going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the conclusion here becomes the hypothesis and the hypothesis becomes the conclusion. So we have this one. If you are not going to play games, then you don't finish your homework. Okay? And then for the contrapositive, we are going to switch and negate the hypothesis and conclusion. So we have this one. If you are going to play games, then you finish your homework. Okay? So just the inverse form of this converse to have the contrapositive form. Okay? Another example. In your economics, di ba? Suppose this is our if-then statement. If the supply is high, then the demand is low. And this is true, di ba? To have the inverse form, we have this one. If the supply is low, okay, so the opposite of high is low. And then, for the conclusion, the demand is low, this becomes the demand is high. Okay, so the inverse form is if the supply is low, then the demand is high. And then for the converse form, just switch the position of the hypothesis and conclusion. So the conclusion here becomes the hypothesis and the hypothesis becomes the conclusion. So we have this one. If the demand is low, then the supply is high. Then for the contrapositive, just switch and negate the hypothesis and conclusion of the original statement, or just give the inverse form of the converse statement. Okay, so we have this one. If the demand is high, then the supply is low. Okay, so that is our contrapositive form. Okay, another example. Suppose this is our original statement or the if-then statement. If you see a shooting star, then you should say a wish. So this is our belief, right? When we see a shooting star, we should say a wish, because it says that if we are going to say a wish, it will become true. Okay? So, if you see a shooting star, so you see a shooting star is our hypothesis. Then, you should say a wish. So, you should say a wish is our conclusion. Now, for the inverse form, we just negate or take the opposite of the hypothesis, which is you see a shooting star. So the opposite of that is you don't see a shooting star. And then for the conclusion, you should say a wish. The inverse form of that is you should not say a wish. Okay, so the whole inverse form is if you don't see a shooting star, then you should not say a wish. Then for the converse form, okay, for the converse, just switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So our hypothesis becomes you should say a wish, and then our conclusion becomes you see a shooting star. Okay, so the whole converse form is if you should say a wish, then you see a shooting star. Okay, for the contrapositive, just negate this converse form or give the opposite of this converse form. So we have this one. If you should not say a wish, then you don't see a shooting star. Okay? So that's all. I hope you understand these examples. Okay, so goodbye. Thank you for watching.